Yeah, so my whole thing about economics is that I'm really not sure that the value of the dollar will necessarily go up as a result of all of these credit card defaults and everything else. But what I would tell you is that the price of everything else relative to the dollar is going to crash, and I feel that the story of what's going on is that the seeds of destruction and price destruction and the Doom Index and or Doom Vortex of pressure is actually growing in the market. And you know, I say this, I have to come forward at a moment in which I'm heavily concerned about economics. And the reason why I'm concerned is because the signs that I'm seeing and parallels that I'm seeing trace all the way back to 1930 in a market and a time in which the average consumer or individual that's doing economics and thinking about it and thinking about things is buying and hedging themselves as if it's 1970s stagflation and everything. But I think the story of what's going on is one in which it's really scary and unfortunate what's transpiring. I mean, like, Klarna users are buying now but not paying later. Another bit of concerning news and everything that's either circulating through the system. I mean, I'm paying off my debt, so I'm being a responsible person, but I'm looking out there around at my surroundings and seeing that almost a huge number of other people are not. And you know the the problem with all that too is that when I see financial channels talking about this stuff, they're talking about how it's destruction of the credibility of the dollar and everything, the underlying currency of my country and everything, and that's what the channels are talking about. But I don't think that this spells ill winds for the dollar, which will be stable no matter what happens, and it may even go up as a consequence of all of this, and because if you think about it and you begin to understand it, you understand terms like, liquidity crisis and what happens, when there's just too little money floating around or chasing after, for instance, stocks, and bonds, and, we're really just more stocks than anything else when there's too little, capital coming in to the market and, buying anything. And when too little money is coming in, it creates a liquidity crisis and everything. And the whole of the problem, at least like I said, is there's this fundamental misunderstanding. I mean, housing prices from 2007 to 2009 fell 20%. And what people are not understanding is that that is the ultimate consequence of when people pull shit like this is what is known as defaulting on your debt. Klarna users are buying out now, but buying now but not paying later. So when a person is said to be in default, they're basically not. They owe money and they're not paying it. And when and that's what a default is. That's what it means to be. Defaults are is when people don't pay the debts that they owe, and this is inherently a deflationary phenomenon. And like I said, it has to be because you have a system in which so much of the modern economy is dependent on credit, and what happens is that credit freezes up. In that lenders start to, you know, what they start to do is they start to get tighten the belts and raise interest rates even on the people they are still lending to in a credit crunch. And subprime borrowers and even prime borrowers, unless you're like super prime, cannot ultimately get a loan. And when that happens, it has this pernicious effect ultimately on aggregate demand for goods and services. It just because people can't get loans anymore to buy the stuff. And when that happens and everything, and when people's credits are maxed out all over the place, and they stop paying it and they seize up, you've got a credit market now where lenders are extremely reluctant to lend anybody money. And then what happens is that aggregate demand for goods and services collapses, and why business, and like many have pointed out, prices are sticky. They don't adjust to the new market reality immediately, but eventually they're forced to capitulate, in response to these phenomenon. And does this necessarily mean that the dollar goes up? No, but the dollar still goes further because everybody else is forced to take a haircut and pay, take less money for their goods and services that they're offering on the market as a consequence of all of it, because demand falls apart in a situation in which credit freezes up, and and creditors tighten the screws ultimately. And that's what we're now moving back towards, is this whole tightening of credit, and thus that leads directly into what is known as a liquidity crisis, when there's just too little money moving around, and the velocity of money starts to collapse all over again. And I know it feels like there's a lot of money out there and everything, and that there's trillions and trillions of dollars sloshing around in somebody's bank account, or at least on their balance sheet, that they're hypothetically thinking that they're going to receive. But the ultimate problem with all of that is that none of it really matters if you've got a bunch of sharks that are essentially sitting on large pools of cash but are not using it or deploying it at all. It really doesn't have that much any impact on prices if you've got a massive pool of cash sitting somewhere, but the person is just not using it at all. They're not even buying stocks. It's just sitting in their mattress basically, and they're not doing anything with it. At that point, you've got a scenario where the velocity of money is basically nothing. And we've had, this is why the Fed has had so much trouble ultimately bringing uh I mean, if they had helicopter cashed on poor folk and ordinary people and everything, it would have done a lot more to stimulate demand. But they let people like themselves and the banks and people like the hedge funds and everything have most of the cash that went into quantitative easing. And so you had a velocity of money at the Fed. And I want you to pay attention to the long-term chart here, which is, this is clearly why it wasn't working. And the Fed's intervention, at least hypothetically anyways, to look at this chart. I mean, while it has had some uptick in recent times, in the recent months and everything, it's back on the decline just recently in the most recent data. And we'll see when the next one comes in if it starts to slow down again and the trend starts to reverse. But we've had a pretty massive slowdown in the amount of money that was moving around and the velocity of money since quarter three, and the peak in quarter three of 1997. Money isn't changing hands as fast at all, as we're seeing in this chart, which means that even if there is a ton of money out there, it's just not moving around. And that kind of punches a hole in the narrative of the Austrian economist and everything, which is just that despite the massive money supply, the money just isn't moving around at all. It's all frozen up and trapped in some kind of liquidity trap. And as a consequence of all of this, you've got debt defaults happening all over the place. People taking out credit cards to pay for their burritos and everything else in the economy all over the place. They're taking out debts to do this. And while for now that really only matters to the households that are part of the problem, I mean, if this starts to get worse, and there's absolutely no reason to believe that anything will be ameliorated given America's clear and fundamental addiction to credit and everything, there's no reason to think and feel that this will get better at all. There really isn't any encouraging news at all. And the reasons to suspect doom and gloom are only mounting, and you know, it just what I'm seeing out there does not make me think 1970s stagflation. It makes me think 1930s Great Depression era stuff because, we did not live through. We haven't lived through a depression in a very long time as a nation. The people that remember what it was like are dead. The greatest generation is basically gone at this point, and they failed to pass on fully the memories of the Great Depression to their youth. And what was the Great Depression but a deflationary scenario? The value of everything plummeted. As a consequence of the crisis. Asset prices absolutely went into free fall, and you had this whole terrible, terrible times in this country, and the whole of the problem at this point is that all of this stuff, it's only affecting one social stratosphere in this country. It's not affecting the other, and everything. It's only affecting one social group and everything, and that's the subprime, borrowers for the time being, and but as this problem of people not paying their debts grows and it gets worse, and there are more and more parties, that are doing it, once it starts to add up to millions and millions and millions of Americans, it starts to become basically it becomes a financial contagion, and it becomes a systematic problem for the entire economy. Like and the whole problem is that I just don't see things getting better. I see a lot of irresponsible behavior out there. And I see a country that is fundamentally addicted to credit, and I think that things are going to get much worse before they get better.